Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kriti Gupta. Tonight, developments on a TikTok sale. The president arrives in the UK. The House GOP unveils their budget and federal charges against the man suspected of killing Charlie Kirk.
I am filing a criminal information charging Tyler James Robinson, age 22, with the following crimes. Count 1, aggravated murder, a capital offense.
The scene playing out today in Utah after the murder suspect in the Charlie Kirk fatal shooting case is charged, now set to appear before a court of law. More on those charges as the suspect makes his first public appearance since his arrest.
Plus, details of the potential sale of TikTok after the president announced a consortium of buyers have been identified. U.S. companies said to be coming together for the purchase as the White House extends the TikTok deadline to the end of the year. Who's lining up to buy the company and what it means for its 170 million U.S. users, all up ahead.
Also tonight, the president heads to the UK. Donald Trump landing in England after departing Washington, D.C. this morning. The president's journey to London coming as Israel launches its long-promised ground assault in Gaza. We'll discuss the president's trip and the major issues overseas coming up.
And the House GOP unveils its budget plan with just 6 working days to go before a government shutdown. We'll dive into what's in their proposal, the timing for a vote, and how Democrats are reacting.
We've got all that news and a lot more for you tonight with our reporters fanned out across the country with Bloomberg's Hadriana Lowenkron from the White House, Alex Levine from World Headquarters in New York. Michael McKee is with us here on set, and Myles Miller also from New York. And we begin tonight at the White House. As President Trump arrives in the UK with multiple international crises awaiting him, the president making news on everything from Ukraine to Israel, Gaza, and even TikTok, India, and more en route to England. Joining us now with the expectations for his trip, Bloomberg's Hadriana Lowenkron is reporting live from the North Lawn at the White House. What's on the agenda, Hadriana?
Right. Well, definitely, as you mentioned, a pretty productive flight with the president signing that extension, essentially allowing more time. Otherwise, there would be a ban in place tomorrow. We have this consortium, which we'll talk about later, but a busy flight just to get there. But since touching down, I think the important things for us on the agenda are trade and economic deals. So the U.S. and the U.K. are expected to announce, upwards of $10 billion worth of deals, a lot of them scientific, some of them defense related. And this is something that the president has done in previous trips. He was, of course, in the Middle East earlier this year, really touting those deals as, revenue, especially as the tariffs and the impact of the economy there. We're still tracking. And to that end of the trade deals that we are looking at, potentially there could be some concessions that the president is willing to make with that UK deal. And so that is something we're going to look to hear more about involving tariffs with UK's prime minister.
Hadriana, it feels like on the flight over, we got plenty of headlines from Benjamin Netanyahu, from Ursula von der Leyen saying they had both spoken to Donald Trump potentially on the flight. In the meantime, tech and crypto very much on the agenda. Can you just walk us through how that might show up in what we hear in the UK?
Absolutely. So on the tech front, as I had mentioned, a lot of money, again, more than $10 billion worth of economic deals that we're expecting. There is going to be a summit of sorts with a lot of tech, big wigs in the tech industry flying to the UK. Altman of OpenAI, one of them, to discuss some of these partnerships that we're hoping to get out. But then on the other hand, something that we are curious whether it will come up or not is this idea of the Online Safety Act, which essentially gives the UK government powers to essentially regulate internet content. And that has impacted some companies such as Apple. That's something where, Tim Cook has come to the White House and talked to the president. And so still waiting to see, how that plays out in terms of conversations. And then, on the tariff front, a big question for the UK is steel and aluminum tariffs. That's something where they're hoping that maybe that rate goes down from the negotiated 25%. And something else on the UK's mind, of course, is Scotch whiskey tariffs. So really a lot to track there on the trade and tech front.
Just when we thought he had a little bit more clarity on the trade front, Hadriana Lowenkron tells us that's not true. We thank you so much for reporting live tonight from the White House North Lawn. We certainly appreciate that reporting. Meanwhile, earlier today, as she mentioned, President Trump signed an executive order extending the deadline for China to divest the platform's U.S. operations for a fourth time. But also said a preliminary deal is done.
We have a deal on TikTok. I've reached a deal with China. I'm going to speak to President Xi on Friday to confirm everything up. We made a very good trade deal, and I hope good for both countries. And we have a group of very big companies that want to buy it.
The deal reportedly in the works would divest roughly 80% of the company to an investor consortium that includes Oracle, Silver Lake, and Anderson Horowitz. Joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Alexandra Levine. Alexandra, just walk us through what we know here. Are all of these players the same players that were maybe in the running a few months ago?
Yes, all of these players are parties that were actually part of a group proposed back in April. We were very close, almost at the finish line back in April to reaching a deal, and then the tariff war between the U.S. and China escalated, and everything basically was stalled and then put on hold. And then we heard a little bit more about this over the summer, and now it seems that the group that is being floated is actually the same group that we started out with, sort of at the beginning of this saga. I think what really remains to be seen, though, is what happens with the algorithm. The key sticking point has never been around who the buyers will be. The key sticking point here was always what ByteDance or China would agree to do with the algorithm. And without
that's the question that I have, Alexandra. Sorry to interrupt you. As we understand it, it would be licensed, if I get that correctly, from ByteDance. There's a law, of course, on the books that says divest or ban. Would that licensing mechanism meet the letter of the law?
The licensing mechanism, that would actually not be compliant with the law. So there have been a few different things proposed with the algorithm, but without a full divestiture or separation so that ByteDance does not have any operational relationship with the algorithm, it actually would not be compliant with the law. And I think what remains to be seen between now and Friday is, as more details about this framework come out, whether we hear voices in Congress, including members of Trump's own camp, who were very instrumental in writing the law, come out to push back against some sort of a framework that might not actually meet all of the requirements.
This at one time was a bipartisan affair in Washington. Alexandra Levine, thank you so much for the update in New York. Back here in Washington, of course, we're just hours away from the big Fed decision as we get developments throughout the day on just who will be in the room for the September meeting, who's already in the room. After some uncertainty, 2 key board members are, in fact, in attendance. The newest member, Stephen Myran, approved by the Senate late last night, sworn in just this morning. This is his first day on the job in a Fed meeting. Lisa Cook, also present now, despite President Trump's effort to fire her from the board. Joining us with a preview of this 2-day session, live from our Washington bureau, is Bloomberg's Michael McKee. At least we know who's going to be there. You were actually pointing out earlier, it's entirely possible they're sitting shoulder to shoulder based on the seniority that's used to establish the seating.
Have you ever been to a party where, some of the people don't like each other and how awkward it is? You can imagine what it must be like in that room today. I know Wall Street cares more about what the Fed is going to do than what the personalities were like. But right now we are expecting a 25 basis point cut. And the question is somebody going to dissent and demand a 50 basis point cut? If anybody does, the betting it would be this gentleman, Stephen Myran. Right. But it also could be the vice chair, and it could be Chris Waller as well, who came into the meeting saying that he thought only 25 would be possible. And then there's people who think they shouldn't cut at all. So it's an open question. We'll get a cut, but it's an open question about how many dissents.
If there's something that unites Stephen Myran and Lisa Cook, is that they are both doves on the committee at the end of the day, or perceived doves on the committee. If the White House moves forward with taking this up to the Supreme Court when it comes to Lisa Cook's firing, what does that mean for what the committee looks like, not in this meeting, but in the next one?
Well, that's going to be a real question for everybody on Wall Street who looks at the dot plot for what's going to happen next year and tries to figure out what happens if these people change. And there's a good chance that that could happen. Now, we don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do. The administration says they will appeal. The court tells us they have not yet tonight. And so there's no news coming tonight. They will both vote tomorrow. But if they rule against her, then it is likely the president will try to appoint somebody new almost immediately to fill that spot and make it a fait accompli, whether or not she wins her case or not. And then you've got Jay Powell. Does he stay? Does he go? and then the tinfoil hat conspiracy of getting rid of all of the Fed bank presidents. All of this is a possibility, some of it more fantastical than others. But if the entire board changes or the presidents change, then how do you figure out what the Fed's monetary policy is going to be? You can assume if it's Trump that it's cut rates. But would they really do that? Would they really cut rates if they think the economy is not in great shape? It's going to be a fascinating time over the next couple of months to see how all this plays out.
Well, you're going to be in the room for the news conference tomorrow, which will also be fascinating. I don't know how you craft questions if they're about data, if they're about building renovations, or who's being fired or hired at the Fed. How do you pick your spots here?
I think that everybody's going to have a series of questions to ask along those lines. I would imagine that we'll do the data first, the Fed decision first, but there's got to be some questions about what was it like in the room today?
Yeah, he's got a lot to prepare for.
That's code for Mike McKee's not going to tell us what he's going to ask. Bloomberg's Mike McKee, we thank you so much for walking us through those dynamics. Let's go to developments in Utah now after officials convened a press conference to announce the charges against 22-year-old Tyler Robinson for the killing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. A court now holding a hearing with Robinson, the suspect, appearing in public for the first time since the shooting and his arrest as a judge presides. The hearing happening right now, coming after prosecutors in Utah, like we had just said, charged Robinson of first-degree aggravated murder in a case that has galvanized politicians on both sides over the rise of political violence. Joining us now with the latest from World Headquarters in New York is our very own Myles Miller. Myles, just walk us through what we know and what we just saw on screen.
Yeah, so you can see the suspect is in a prison uniform, green prison uniform, and he is joining the court from his jail cell at the Utah County Jail. Earlier today, the Utah County District Attorney outlined a case that is voluminous when it comes to evidence. In the case, we know that the suspect, identified as Tyler Robinson, left a note under his computer keyboard confessing to the killing. In that note, he said, "I had the opportunity to take out Charlie Kirk, and I'm going to take it." And in addition to that, we learned of text message evidence that he texted his roommate, who's also his romantic partner, and admitted to what he'd done, writing, "I am sorry," and later saying, "I had enough of his hatred." He urged the roommate to delete those messages and also to stay quiet if police ask questions, and that's part of the charges that are levied against him. Among the charges is a capital murder charge, which carries the possibility of the death penalty in this case. And what we also know is that Robinson, in addition to that, faces some other stiff punishments with the possibility of a federal case against him as well. Of course, Kirk, 31-year-old founder of Turning Point USA, was shot while speaking to a crowd of 3,000 people. Among the people in the crowd, people under the age of 18. So we saw a charge of firing that gun in a place where children were present.
Myles, just for the benefit of our radio listeners right now, this is pretty remarkable to be seeing the suspect on a live video feed. He's appearing virtually in court, sitting essentially motionless and emotionless against a white brick wall, a cinder block wall. We see the judge looking down and speaking above him with counsel in the courtroom as well. What will be the rules for cameras in the courtroom? Will we be seeing him for each day of this trial?
Yeah, Utah has a pretty lenient policy when it comes to access to press or access to video for press when it comes to court cases. We saw that, of course, with the less serious case of the case against Gwyneth Paltrow, that civil case. So we expect to see everything that involves the state case to be televised and for it to be out for the public. In the event of that federal case, of course, no cameras in federal court. So if there is a federal case, we won't be seeing that. But it appears as though every action that happens in court over the next few months and perhaps year will be broadcast for everybody to see.
Wow, that's something. And Myles will help us decipher it all. With us from World Headquarters in New York, Myles Miller, thank you. Coming up on Balance of Power, House Republicans have released their plan to avert a government shutdown. The CR is out. But how are their colleagues from across the aisle reacting? We'll discuss with Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramanyam of Virginia up ahead. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I will act independently, as the Federal Reserve always does, based on my own personal analysis of economic data. I plan to dutifully carry out my role pursuant to the mandates assigned by Congress. Independence of monetary policy is a critical element for its success.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kriti Gupta. You were just listening to Stephen Miran, the newest member of the Federal Reserve Board, during his Senate committee hearing on September 4th. Now, last night, his nomination passed a full Senate vote, and just this morning, he was sworn in, just moments before a closely watched meeting of the Fed's rate-setting panel got underway. Also in attendance, Fed Governor Lisa Cook, after an appeals court affirmed late Monday that she can continue working while her lawsuit challenging Trump's efforts to remove her proceeds. The administration could still, however, ask the Supreme Court to step in. It all sets the stage for tomorrow's decision on whether the Federal Reserve will lower rates for the first time this year, a move investors are increasingly confident is a sure thing. For more, let's turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, is it safe to say it's a sure thing?
I think so. I mean, it would be really shocking if they did not cut by 25 basis points tomorrow. The market has priced this in pretty aggressively, and Jay Powell himself seemed to telegraph that last month at the Jackson Hole. But I think, as you alluded to, Kriti, in your setup here, there's so much more intrigue about the people in that room, the politics in that room, and more importantly, the long-term trajectory of this Fed meeting. Remember, there's a big lag between we really know what goes on in that room. We get the minutes about a month and a half after, but it takes 5 years before we actually get the transcripts. The big question is, what's the debate going to be? Not so much about this rate cut, but about the dot plot, about the summary of economic projections that they also have to telegraph tomorrow, and what that means heading into 2026 and beyond. Here's the setup, though, Kriti. Markets are at a record high. They were basically flat on the day, but you have effectively the S&P and the NASDAQ camped out at record highs. But two of the biggest beneficiaries of a potentially long-term rate-cutting cycle here in the United States are going to be two big asset classes, mainly emerging market stocks, which outperformed for an 8th straight day, and gold, which has set consecutive record high after consecutive record high. The idea that as rates come down, of course, that makes gold a little bit more attractive, particularly given the uncertainty that a lot of people have about economic conditions.
I know our own Mike McGlone at Bloomberg Intelligence has been looking at $4,000 for gold for this very same set of reasons, Romaine. And we're all bogged down in the drama down here. What's Lisa Cook going to say to Stephen Miran? What is his first day on the job like? And as you remind us, we need to wait 5 years to actually get the transcript and option the film. So the point here is Wall Street is focused on the dot plot, on the data, and not the gossip or the backroom parlor game?
Well, I don't know, Joe. I mean, maybe a little bit of both. I think Jay Powell is going to have to come out at that 2:30 press conference and really articulate what the Fed's path going forward is. But let's, put this out there and just say it flat out, Joe. He's basically a lame duck leader at this point. Whether he leaves at the end of his term in the spring of 2026 or before that, most of the speculation will be how much faith can you put into that dot plot and those summary of economic projections, not only because Jay Powell won't actually be there to see them all the way through 2026, but several other members of this committee also won't be there as well because their terms are also set to expire in 2026 as well.
Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. You don't want him to call you a lame duck. Thank you.
No, my
Earlier
apology.
today, House Republicans unveiled their stopgap spending bill. We finally got to see the text of the CR. And of course, we've been asking a lot about the date on that plan here, because we know we run out of money on October 1st. That's the shutdown deadline. House Speaker Mike Johnson discussed how his Democratic colleagues are responding to his party's plan now. It would fund the government through November 21st, along with their threats of a shutdown. Listen.
Predictably and unfortunately, there are some Democrats who are openly pining for a government shutdown. In spite of this obvious and necessary step, they're grasping for straws as a party, and so some of them apparently believe that shutting down the government will be some sort of life raft for them so they can regain the support of the American people. I just think that is a fool's gambit.
Joining us now with his perspective from across the aisle, Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramanyam of Virginia, who's live on Capitol Hill. Congressman, it's good to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. There's been a big conversation about extending Obamacare subsidies, tax credits that are set to expire at the end of the year, that might be the item that brings Democrats on board with this plan. But of course, this expires before the end of the year. Would you vote to keep the government open through Thanksgiving?
Look, I'd want to see what's in the bill. They haven't approached me. They haven't approached us. The Republicans who are in charge right now of the House and in charge and have a trifecta have not made any effort to be bipartisan. And so they really need to own this, right? And in the end, I think what they're trying to do is skirt their responsibility to the American people to provide them quality, affordable health care. And so, yeah, the ACA tax credits that would raise premiums significantly for people, that's a high priority for me and for a lot of other Democrats.
Congressman, if that isn't on the table in this round of negotiations, is there something else you and your party are looking at?
Well, it's really simple. It's that, they're taking away the health care benefits. And for me, I represent a lot of federal workers, and we've seen a lot of firings and a lot of infringement upon Congress's spending power. And so I want to see some changes there as well. And so I'm not optimistic because, again, they haven't approached me or any other Democrat really to try to make an effort to work together, which is what I think the American people want. So in the end, I'm going to look at what they give me, and if they don't have any of these items that I've asked for many months now, it's hard for me to support a CR like this.
Understood. I don't know if you're weighing odds of a shutdown right now, Congressman, but there are other conversations being had on Capitol Hill, and one of them has to do with your own safety and security, along with that of your staff, following the killing of Charlie Kirk. Speaker Johnson was to present his Republican conference with options today by way of the chair of the admin committee, Brian Stile, to talk about enhancing security, how much money should be spent, what each member should receive. Have you been briefed as a Democrat? Has the Democratic conference heard about this from Hakeem Jeffries? And do you think the numbers that are being bandied about are high enough?
Yeah, we did get a briefing, and, we had a threat to our own office as well, and we worked with Capitol Police on an investigation, and we took the necessary legal and security measures. But certainly, I think people are on high alert right now. I know I had security for the first time since I got elected to Congress this past weekend when I went to events, especially outdoor public events. And many of the people who were there thanked me for having security, actually, because I don't want other people to feel scared that I'm there, right? Because they might feel I'm a target, and if I don't have security, they become a target as well. So we want constituents to feel safe at our events. We want people to feel safe when they visit our office, and certainly I want my family to be safe as well.
Well, we heard about that threat that was directed at your office. A constituent threatened to bring a firearm to your district office. Did you receive additional security from Capitol Police, Congressman? How did that play out?
Capitol Police did an investigation. I ended up taking legal action by filing a protective order, and we have a temporary one in place. We'll see if a permanent one is needed. And we're working with Capitol Police on enhanced security in my home as well as in our offices as well. We're also looking at how much security, how many security guards we need at our events. But rest assured to the public, we're going to do everything we can to keep our events secure, and certainly I want to do everything I can to keep my family safe as well.
Well, Congressman, bringing it right back to Joe's initial point, in the stopgap bill that's been proposed, $30 million has been allocated for security measures. Is that number enough to you?
It seems a little low. With that said, we're very efficient with the dollars that we have in our office, and certainly, we prioritize certain events. We'd love more security. It's mostly for the public events where we have a lot of constituents there. We just do not want anything to happen because, people may think it's a lot of money, but in the end, it's about being able to share your opinion, have public discourse, and meet with your constituents, and the constituents meet with your representatives without feeling like there's a threat to someone's life or security. And so that's the cornerstone of our democracy. And so that's worth protecting. It's worth the money to protect that.
President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance have been among those suggesting that this is not an even playing field, that the threats are coming from the radical left, Congressman, that Republicans are the ones being targeted. We've, of course, seen a series of threats and attacks, even fatal ones, as we saw in Minnesota against Democrats over the past year. Are you worried that this blame game is going in the wrong direction?
Well, the blame game doesn't help, right? You can't say that you want to tone down the rhetoric and then call this a civil war, like one person said, or say that this is all coming from one side and we need to pay back. Right, so that's not helpful either. I think what is helpful is coming together, certainly, acknowledging that this is happening to both sides. We had in Minnesota 2 lawmakers shot. We had in Michigan a lawmaker almost kidnapped, a sitting governor in Pennsylvania, his house set on fire. I mean, we've had a lot of incidents happen to Democrats too, but we want to acknowledge that it happens to Republicans as well, and we want to acknowledge there's a political violence problem on both parties. I've been calling for hearings now. I want to continue to look at what Congress can do to make people who put themselves out there in the arena safer.
Congressman, I'd like to speak to you about your perch on the Oversight Committee. Can you give us an update and the status on the subpoena to the DOJ in terms of the release of the Epstein files? What's the latest there?
You know, the DOJ keeps releasing files, many of which have already been made public before. They're not releasing the files that we're looking for. We were able to get quite a few documents from the estate, which again proved that the president had lied about not writing Epstein a letter. Jeffrey Epstein committed one of the worst criminal trafficking rings in history, and so he needs to pay for it, and he never really did. And so Ghislaine Maxwell, we have an opportunity to bring her to justice. We have an opportunity to bring closure to many of the victims, many of whom are now actively helping us in this investigation. But I think as a country, we let them down, the victims, and we owe it to them and owe it to the American people to show that no matter how much power you have, how much money you have, that you will be brought to justice if you sexually exploit young girls like this.
Well, there's an additional Democrat in the House now in James Walkinshaw, who won Jerry Connolly's former seat in your state of Virginia. It would only take one more member of Congress, a D or an R, to force the discharge petition that would also aim to force the release of the Epstein files. Congressman, is that a more efficient path? You only need one more member.
Yes, and we're very happy to have my neighbor in Virginia, James Walkinshaw, Adelita Grijalva as well in Arizona. We expect her to be elected on September 23rd, and I think that might be the final signature. Now I'd like to see, one, how Republicans actually vote on the release of the files. They've been talking a big game about this. Let's see how they actually vote on the floor. And then two, if the vote is successful, I want to see the president and this administration release it. I'm not optimistic about that, but we're certainly going to force the issue because, again, the American people deserve the truth and deserve transparency.
Stay in touch with us on this. Democratic Congressman Suhas Subramanyam of Virginia, we thank you for the conversation on balance of power. President Trump arrived a short time ago in the UK, as we told you, ahead of his second state visit, where he will meet with the royal family, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and more as multiple international crises play out. So if you're with us on Bloomberg TV, a shot of the president and first lady making their arrival a short time ago. This all includes the developments on the ground in Gaza as Israel troops move into Gaza City, something the president commented on before departing Washington.
We're going to see what happens because I hear Hamas is trying to use the old human shield deal, and if they do that, they're going to be in big trouble. They're going to be in big trouble. They put it out 2 days ago that they're going to use the hostages as human shields. That's something that hasn't been done for a long time, you know. If they do that, they're in big trouble.
Joining us now with the latest on what is occurring on the ground in Gaza, Bloomberg's Eric Martin. Eric, what does today's ground invasion say about the possibility of an Israel-Hamas ceasefire, or are we simply beyond that?
Joe, it's been an exhausting 48 hours. Arrived this afternoon with Secretary of State Rubio after a last-minute trip to Doha to try to reaffirm the relationship with Qatar, a key ally in the Middle East for the U.S. And this offensive, really the message from Secretary Rubio this afternoon has been that this is a last opportunity, or that the window is short for Hamas to reach a negotiated peace settlement. I asked Secretary Rubio about this afternoon. He said we're talking about the matter of days, potentially weeks, to possibly avert an escalation of the war, but that the U.S. does back the Israeli government if a kind of precision and a very specific operation is needed in Gaza City in order to eliminate the Hamas threat. So that's where we are. We had this trip to Qatar several hours east today. to fly a number of hours west to be here for President Trump's state visit, and that's where things are after this 48-hour visit by Secretary Rubio and meetings with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem.
Eric, in the last couple of months, all summer really, you've had several countries in Europe, Canada, Australia, who've started talking about the fact that they're going to recognize Palestine, depart from the foreign policy view that the United States has when it comes to the UNGA meetings in New York. Is that having any effect on the conversations when it comes to Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, certainly this issue of the war in Gaza and the war in the Middle East hangs over the UN General Assembly meetings, high-level leaders meetings next week. It's something everyone is focused on. This visit by Secretary Rubio to Israel and was in some way kind of a preparation for that, because we know that this will be a topic of discussion in New York. But certainly the Trump administration has said that the recognition of a Palestinian state, which doesn't exist in terms of a governing structure and in terms of order in the Palestinian areas, they see as counterproductive to the goal of ending the war, eliminating Hamas, bringing the 48 hostages home. And so that's something they've been quite critical of the countries who are planning to announce this recognition at the UN meetings.
Bloomberg's Eric Barton reporting for us out of London. We thank you so much for your time. I want to get a little bit more analysis here on what Eric was just talking about right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm pleased to say I'm joined this evening by Natasha Hall, Senior Associate with the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Natasha, thank you so much for your time this evening. I want to pick up where we left off with Eric, which is simply that if Israel is beginning their ground operations in Gaza City, does that eliminate all prospects of a ceasefire with Hamas? Where are we on that?
Well, I'd probably reiterate exactly what I've been doing for about a year or more on your show, which is that we will likely see a continuation of this war unless the United States applies pressure to Israel, a country that doesn't seem to want to end the war. And in fact, just a few days ago, tried to kill negotiators once again in Doha, Qatar. And so I suspect, from what we've been seeing, very intense bombardment from the sea, airstrikes, shelling, and 3 divisions going into Gaza City. This is a place that is a fourth of the size of Washington, D.C., and we've recently heard that a famine has been declared on it. So I think if there was ever going to be pressure applied by a U.S. administration, it would need to be now, but we're not seeing that.
Quite the opposite, Natasha, and it's great to have you back. The president on Truth Social got to this a few hours ago, having referred to reports that Hamas, as you just heard him say, moved hostages above ground to use them as human shields. He wrote, "This is a human atrocity, the likes of which few people have ever seen before. Don't let this happen or all bets are off." Gaza already looks like the surface of the moon. What does all bets are off mean?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is the annihilation of something that's already annihilated. Just this week, we also heard from the UN Human Rights Office that has decided to declare this a genocide. So it's unclear what kind of war crimes the United States is talking about right now, because it does seem to be that the United States and Israel is on a completely different page than the rest of the world when they look at what's going on. And I would also say that we have hostage families that are sitting outside Prime Minister Netanyahu's house demanding an end to this war because they are worried about the lives of their families. They know that them coming home alive, and there's about 20 left that might be alive, would happen probably through a negotiated settlement and not what we're seeing right now.
Natasha, if we are looking for the United States to apply pressure, is there a line in the sand, a red line, if you will, if not a kind of unsanctioned attack on a country that holds a U.S. military base? What is that line in the sand, if not that?
That's an excellent question, and I really don't know what that line in the sand is. We recently saw an Israeli strike I mentioned on Qatar. This is the forward headquarters of Central Command for the U.S. military. So this is a really profound, audacious strike. And we didn't really hear much from this administration about that. In fact, they were kind of running in circles trying to justify both sides, both Qatar's anger about that and also Israel's motivations for doing so. And the big question for me is, where else are Hamas leaders in the world? And one of those places is Turkey, which is a NATO member. So, I mean, the big question is, how much can this escalate? But I would say that I don't really see any lines at this point.
Well, that would be the definition of escalation. But let's stick with Qatar for a moment, Natasha. Marco Rubio was in Israel just hours before this invasion of Gaza City began. The Secretary of State then went directly to Doha, went to Qatar to try to convince them to re-engage in mediation talks. Is that possible at this point? Is that the only hope for a potential ceasefire?
Well, I think Qatar, much like other Gulf countries, really depends on the United States for its security. But it sees what's going on in Qatar and it sees what's going on in the rest of the region. And frankly, it's quite fearful. So I think Rubio's trip to Qatar was essentially damage control. And you saw that through his statements about, getting closer to a defense agreement of some kind with Qatar. So I think Qatar is trying to demand as much as possible to ensure that this never, ever happens again. But again, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for a lot of the countries in the region to trust the United States from here on out. And they'll likely be hedging their bets when it comes to security arrangements.
Benjamin Netanyahu has said that he's due to visit Donald Trump in about 2 weeks' time. I think it's conveniently right after some of the UNGA meetings in New York, where a lot of countries are expected to recognize Palestine and really depart from American foreign policy there. What do you expect to happen at that meeting?
Well, I think this is essentially going to be a show of support after exactly what you said, these UNGA meetings, these high-level meetings in which I think that there's going to be a lot of ire directed towards Israel and discussing reports that just came out. I mentioned the one from the UN Human Rights Office recently. And so this is just to show this solid relationship, I think, between Israel and the United States that hasn't been diminished at all throughout all of this. And I think it's also, Netanyahu wants to show he's quite the political animal, and he wants to reassure Israelis that that relationship that they very much depend on security-wise is still strong, even throughout all of the various attacks that we've seen throughout the region.
Well, Natasha, you probably saw that Iran's top nuclear official warned of chaos in the region if diplomats at the UN block a motion to censure Israeli and U.S. military attacks on the Islamic Republic in June. How big of a story will this be next week, and how likely is Iran to be disappointed?
I mean, this is a really good question, because I think a lot of countries in the region and the world also want Iran on its back foot until it agrees to some kind of nuclear arrangement, right? But at the same time, we're seeing some really devastating violations of sovereignty in the region. And so, it remains to be seen, I think, if some of the countries will want to put their foot down. What I would say is that I think Russia, China, other U.S. adversaries will certainly use everything that's going on, including strikes on Iran and throughout the region, as a reason why, the United States can't be relied on, and point to the hypocrisy there. And so I think that's a larger issue that's going to come out of these UNGA sessions and beyond.
Well, sticking with Iran, there's also a question here, and I believe it comes in October, where there's another round of sanctions that are due to be applied, and a lot of that effort being spearheaded by some of the European leaders. Talk to us a little bit about who Iran has to turn to. With the Houthis, with Hamas, with Hezbollah, and even Russia otherwise occupied, who can Iran lean on right now?
Yeah, Iran is really backed into a corner. You had the fall of Assad. The Houthis are still attacking, but they are not, intimately tied to Iran. But really, Hezbollah being diminished continuously, day by day, and then, of course, what's going on in Gaza, and also Russia, who has had this growing alliance with Iran, is still working with it militarily, but really for its own interests in Ukraine. And so I think Iran is really backed into a corner. And so the question is, for I think a lot of diplomats, is the way forward more military strikes, which might eliminate Iran's nuclear capacity, might not, but certainly won't get rid of its desire to have nuclear weapons in the future. And so I think the big question for diplomats, including Witkoff and others, is the way forward sanctions, military strikes, or an actual negotiated settlement like we saw with the JCPOA. And I think that Iran is in a situation where it might agree to something like that, but it's unclear to me if there's a lot of momentum on the diplomatic side to do so.
It's always great to have you, Natasha. Thank you for the insights. Natasha Hall is Senior Associate with the Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department at CSIS. Coming up, we'll turn back to our conversation on the impending government funding deadline, shutdown possible at the end of this month when we assemble our political panel. But first, auto safety regulators announcing a probe into Tesla. We'll bring you details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kriti Gupta. The impending government shutdown deadline, plus reaction to the developments out of Utah when our political panel convenes in just a moment. But first, let's get to the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. A New York State judge dismissed the first-degree murder charge against Luigi Mangione, ruling that the prosecutors failed to show he committed the crime as an act of terrorism against workers in the healthcare industry. Mangione still faces the state count of second-degree murder, as well as 8 other counts and federal murder charges. This ruling will likely boost the federal prosecutor's parallel case, where they're seeking the death penalty for what they call a cold-blooded assassination.
U.S. auto safety regulators are now probing whether Tesla's electronically powered doors are a danger to consumers. This probe comes just days after a Bloomberg News investigation uncovered a series of incidents in which people were injured or died after they and others were unable to open their doors after a crash caused their Tesla to lose power. The agency is focusing on the operability of electric door locks from outside the vehicle, but is open to expanding the investigation to cases in which occupants have trouble using the manual releases from inside as well.
And the Taliban has shut down Wi-Fi in a northern Afghanistan province, leaving tens of thousands without internet access, limiting their ability to communicate, attend online classes, and send or receive news. This poses major challenges for the ongoing effort to educate women and girls in the area and represents a furthering tightening of restrictions.
And the president has sued another media company, filing a lawsuit in federal court against the New York Times, claiming the paper of record defamed him and sought to undermine his campaign in last year's election. In the suit, President Trump alleging articles and a book published last year were published to do harm to his 2024 prospects, with Trump seeking damages of at least $15 billion. Times market cap is about $9.5 billion. Since winning last year's election, the president has sued NBC, ABC, CBS, and the Wall Street Journal. All except the Journal have settled their suits. Joining us now with their reaction to these stories and a lot more, our political panel this evening. Meghan Hays is back with us, Democratic strategist, former special assistant to President Biden, alongside Republican strategist Ashley Davis, partner at S3 Group, former special assistant to the Director of Homeland Security. What do you make of this approach, Meghan? If you don't like what you're reading or hearing, you sue. In this case, partly suing, if you read this very lengthy set of documents, to make the case that the New York Times was undermining his fame, suggesting that he only became famous when The Apprentice got on the air, pointing to the likes of Home Alone 2 to prove them wrong. Does he win this lawsuit?
I mean, I'm not sure if the New York Times will settle or not. I just think we're running dangerously close to state-run media. This is how governments are not supposed to work, or democracies. We need to have freedom of the press here, and they need to be the fourth estate. And I think that we are running dangerously close to that, and where we're having undue influence from our executive branch into our media.
He was also in WrestleMania 5. You're not. It's named
I must have missed that one. I'm sorry.
I was about to say you missed the core.
Well,
the core case.
Yeah, it's famous.
Ashley, weigh in here. What do you make of it?
So I do think that there's certain networks that have maybe edited things that was inappropriate, especially during the election. But I do agree with you, Meghan. I mean, this is something that, he's just going to keep fighting. I mean, we have to remember that Donald Trump has spent his entire business career in the courts. And so this is his defense. And so he's going to continue to do it. And So far, as you said, most people have settled, but we'll see what happens with the Wall Street Journal is the most interesting to me. New York Times is a messaging thing more than anything to me.
The Wall Street Journal because it's owned by Rupert Murdoch?
Yeah.
Or more complex than that?
Absolutely. No, just that. And it's more considered a business conservative newspaper. Right. But I do have to say, I get 5 newspapers a day to my house. I still like paper.
I love that.
But the Wall Street Journal definitely has stepped up and challenged the president, especially on tariffs and other business issues that they didn't do 4 or 5 years ago.
Sure. Well, of course, this is News Corp we're talking about. Would that suggest that this is personal and not politics?
I mean, I don't think it's personal. I think that anybody who insults Donald Trump, it becomes very personal to him.
Well, there you go.
So I think it's personal on his side. I don't think it's personal on the media side. I don't necessarily think that there's a bias that everyone wants to say. Yes, of course, there was editing that was, I believe, also was not appropriate to do. But what's also interesting in some of these lawsuits is if they don't want to settle, then let's go to depositions. Does he really want to sit for a deposition, especially with the Wall Street Journal and Epstein? I mean, so it kind of leads, and also the amount of money suggests that it's also just kind of frivolous in its own. $15 billion. It doesn't sit well with me, and I think it just is frivolous in our courts.
Meghan, I'm going to switch the topic here. Are we headed for a shutdown?
So I would hope not, because I have said many times on this program, if you shouldn't shut down the government if you don't have a way to open it. But the fact is that Republicans are in control of both chambers and the executive branch. So I think that Democrats, they need to work with Democrats because they need their votes here. And I really do think that health care and extending these health care for the Affordable Care Act and extending these the subsidies that are there now is a really big sticking issue for the Democrats, especially after what the big, beautiful bill did to Medicaid.
Does it need to be a sticking point in this conversation? The CR text that came out today, Ashley, brings us to November 21st. It's not the end of the year. Democrats could live to debate this another day. Do you think we shut down after what you saw today come out of the House?
So I completely agree with you that there is going to be some sort of negotiation on these subsidies, and there needs to be. And you see certain Republicans and Democrats talking about that. I think that the most important issue here is that Majority Leader Thune has said from the beginning, it's not happening now. So there should absolutely, in regards to a 6-week, 8-week CR that has been introduced, I think that the question is are the Democrats going to fall on their sword over the subsidies right now? And I just don't know if it's a winning issue. Listen, I'm jaded. I've been doing this for 25 years. So I think, no, there's not going to be a shutdown because this is all rhetoric. But if Schumer, the House doesn't really matter. I'm assuming that by Friday, Trump will get some of these outliers that are still on the fence to come in and vote for, and it will pass. And there's rumors that the Senate comes back next Thursday and Friday after the Jewish holiday to figure this out in the Senate. But do we really shut down the government in this? And I think there's several Democrats that have been saying, if we have an agreement that we're going to deal with this November 21st in regards to the subsidies, then why are we shutting down the government now?
Right. You've also got Russ Vought sitting on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And we've talked about this a lot here at this table, and I'm sure Democrats are as well. Are we sure we want to shut things down? Because Russ Vought is salivating over this idea, knowing that there's been no plan to reopen it.
Right. That's exactly right. And I've said that before. And I also just think whether or not Democrats or Republicans, whoever gets blamed, each party is going to get blamed by their own constituents. There are people who are going to primary these folks. So it doesn't matter who takes the overall blame. Each party and each member are going to take the blame in some way, shape, or form.
There's a line of thinking, though, that if these extensions aren't on the docket this time around, or maybe even not on November 21st, that it somehow paves the way for Dems to make a little bit more kind of headway when it comes to the midterms. Is there validity to that argument?
I think that they have to deal with the issue in November. They have to deal with the subsidy issue. I think what they're going to come to is some sort of income cap, which there isn't now. And so, and you see a good group of senators on the Republican and Democrat side that are starting to have this conversation of what that cap should be. Remember, these came in really under COVID. So we shouldn't really, as a fiscal conservative, we should not be living under COVID rules anymore. COVID's over. But I think that Republicans know it's a very tough message. So you can't take it away completely, and it's going to force their hand.
think it was polling from Tony Fabrizio's shop that showed the impact and framed this as the number one issue for Republicans going into the midterms. Why don't Democrats dare Republicans to let them expire?
I just think you're watching a really dangerous line, and there are a lot of Democrats, probably the number one issue for Democrats as well. It's part of it, it's all these kitchen table issues that we talk about, and health insurance is so expansive and covers so much, and there are just so many people that it impacts. I don't think the Democrats are going to take that risk at the end of the day. I think they're going to try to negotiate they can. And they're using all their leverage, right? They're out there together. They're saying, we're going to do it. We're going to shut down. But I think, just like as Ashley was saying, at the end of the day, I don't think anybody wants that government to shut down. So they're going to figure out a way to get this done.
But if not the extensions, then what? What would get the Democrats on board?
That is a great question, and I think they'd be willing to shut down. But I just don't think there are enough Republicans who are willing to lose on the issue of health care, because that is a losing message for them going into the midterms. It's also a very losing message going into the presidential in 28.
All right. Meghan Hays, Ashley Davis, our political panel tonight. We thank you so much for joining us this evening. You learn more about all the stories we've covered here tonight and more. All you have to do is check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And a quick programming note for you. Make sure to tune in tomorrow for Bloomberg Surveillance's special, The Fed Decides. Yeah, tomorrow's it. 1:30 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll be wrapping the early edition of Balance of Power, and we'll walk through this together. The quarter point is the expectation. The news conference remains the big question. When Jay Powell stands before Michael McKee and the rest in that briefing room tomorrow, we could have a lot of news. Stephen Myran, Lisa Cook, and beyond. So join us right here on Bloomberg. Thank you for being with us on this edition of Balance of Power. Thanks again to our panelists. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.